Okay, let's get started. Welcome to SNU UCSD webinar. Today, we have Professor Sangyoon Park from University of Hong Kong. He's going to talk about the economic costs of trade sanctions evidence from North Korea. I'm Jungmin Lee, a professor of economics at Seoul National University. I'm going to moderate this session. We have 1 hour, and Sangyoon will present for 35 minutes, and 25 minutes, we are going to have a Q&A. During his talk, you can leave your comments, questions by using the chat box you can find at the bottom of the screen. And I want to let you know this event will be recorded and uploaded at the UCSD GPS website later, a few days later. Okay, so Sangyoon Park is labor economist and development economist at University of Hong Kong. He has been conducting very interesting research on using a field experiment in Vietnam. And today he's going to talk about North Korea. The economic cost of a trade sanction. This is not only about North Korea, but also about many other countries in recent days in turbulent time. So Sangyoon, without further ado, the floor is yours. You have 35 minutes.
Thank you so much, Jungmin. Let me first share the slides. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much for joining. It's a great pleasure to present this paper here. So this is about trying to understand what are the economic consequences of trade sanctions, and we're going to focus on a particular country that has been recently facing a wave of sanctions on trade. Before I start, let me just briefly go over the background of this project. So we were working on another project trying to collect some meaningful economic measures in North Korea, basically because even though we want to understand what are some of the policy consequences, what are going on in North Korea, inside North Korea, we don't have much quality, high quality economic data. And as an economist, that's very disappointing. So we've been just collecting vast amounts of information, including daytime satellite images, nightlight, and also, and then we were fortunate to come across this firm data set. And we were trying to see if we can use this firm level data set to understand how North Korea has been doing since the implementation of the UN trade sanctions. So we ended up trying to apply some state-of-the-art econometric techniques and models. And hopefully at the end of the day, I'll be able to provide something useful about understanding the effects of trade sanctions. So this is joint work with Ji-hee Kim, Kyu-chul Kim, and also Cheng Sun. I'll first start with a quick motivation. Okay, so since World War II, I think we all know that rather than direct military interventions, countries have been engaging in implementing economic sanctions, and it has been an important tool in foreign diplomacy up until recently, where Russia started this war with Ukraine. But anyways, in the past several years, we've been seeing a series of economic sanctions being imposed against North Korea, and also more recently, we've been seeing that US and EU are imposing economic sanctions against Russia. However, there has been this ongoing debate about how effective these economic sanctions are. It's not so from the point of view of an economist, there are several challenges to understanding the economic impacts of sanctions. The first challenge is regarding causal inference. So we can think of these sanctions as an endogenous response to some of the policies that has been implemented by these target countries. So for example, maybe the country's national policy was a response to any macroeconomic condition that was going on. Then simply just comparing the before and after the sanctions might actually might not give us the credible estimate that we're after. So there's one challenge there. Another challenge is to measurement. So often the target countries we don't have good access to high quality economic data coming out from these target countries. So that makes it difficult to apply more recent economic models in understanding how these countries are doing after the sanctions. So in this paper, our goal is to to provide a credible estimate of the impact of UN trade sanctions on North Korea that was imposed in 2016 and 17. To overcome the first challenge on causal inference, we're going to explore some subnational variations in how each region was exposed to the trade sanctions. And to do that, we're going to use a novel data set on North Korean firms, where we can use a shift share approach to construct this measure of exposure and try to see how that's going to relate to a meaningful measure of economic development in that region. And for that, we're going to use nightlight data, which is basically a proxy for economic development, and to provide some auxiliary analysis or insight into the conditions in North Korea. We're going to combine with market price data, which will help us understand how the price of products were affected after the sanctions. And then taking the reduced form estimates, we're going to combine it with a structural model to estimate the aggregate impact on the country as a whole, and then to predict some counterfactual policy outcomes, which might help us better understand how sanction policies can be designed, or how sanctions can be combined with other policies to how that's going to affect the target country's economy. So just a brief overview of what's been happening in the past decade in North Korea regarding their missile tests and the UN trade sanctions. So if you divide the period into before 2016, you'll see that North Korea has been conducting nuclear tests and also missile tests, but there hasn't been really a sanction on North Korean trade. So it was mostly just targeting institutions or individuals. But following the fourth nuclear test in the first quarter of 2016, there's a UN resolution sanctioning traded goods against North Korea. So that's about 20% of the pre-sanctioned value of goods that North Korea was trading. And then at the end of 2017, we see that share increases to about 60%. So meaning that at the end of 2017, around 60% of the traded goods that North Korea was trading before the sanctions have now been either export sanctioned or import sanctioned. It's hard to tell from this graph, like whether there's a causal relationship between the two. Descriptively, it seems that once the sanctions increase to about 60%, we don't see nuclear tests, but still, missile tests are, there's a surge in missile tests and then goes down. So our goal is not going to be looking at the outcome of whether there's an increase or drop in missile tests, but we're going to try to first have provide an understanding about whether the UN trade sanctions were actually applying any economic pressure against the North Korean economy. So here are a preview of the main findings. So we first provide reduced form evidence by adopting this shift share approach. So we construct a county level exposure of sanctions, first by combining North Korean firm database, which is going to be used to construct the share. For each county, the industry share that are exposed to sanctions, and combining with the UN Comtrade data, which is going to allow us to have a measure of what percent for each industry, what percent of products were sanctioned under the UN sanction resolution. And combining the two is going to give the shift share measure that we need. And then from our reduced form estimate, we find that a 10% increase in export sanctions, so that's a sanction on North Korean export products, reduces nightlight by about 5 log points. And then 10% increase in intermediate input sanction reduces nightlight by about 7.2 log points. Now, to understand what that means to convert that into an economic measure, we separately estimate the nightlight to GDP elasticity using Chinese counties that have similar characteristics to North Korean counties. And from that exercise, we can show that moving a North Korean county from a 25th percentile to the 75th percentile of export or intermediate input sanction lowers the county's manufacturing GDP by about 7%. and about 4.2% respectively. Okay. So looking at the market price data, we find that the products that were import sanctioned, the price drops significantly by about 37.5 percentage points. We don't find a significant drop in export sanctioned products, but we do find that this increase in this price increase among the import sanctioned products are mostly observed in markets outside Pyongyang, and basically there is no increase of market price inside Pyongyang, suggesting that we don't have good evidence, but we can speculate that it's possible that for markets in Pyongyang there's probably some tight price control mechanism, or the government is reallocating more resources or products into Pyongyang so that they can because Pyongyang is basically they have more elites and they're trying to provide more resources there. But that's not going to be the main purpose of this paper. And then we combine the reduced form estimates with the structural model, and the purpose is because from the reduced form estimate, we basically use the variation across counties to come up with this estimate. But maybe in the presence of some general equilibrium effect or spillovers, our reduced form estimate might not provide a accurate number for what's the impact as a country as a whole. So we're going to use the spatial equilibrium model to come up with that aggregate estimate. And there we find that the current trade sanctions caused about a 20% loss in North Korea's manufacturing output. And then as a counterfactual scenario, we see how closing the trade deficit is going to have an additional impact on North Korea's economy. And we see that it's going to lead to about an additional 14% loss in manufacturing output if North Korea has to close on their trade deficits with the rest of the world. Okay, so if you don't have any questions, so I'll move on to the literature. So briefly, the paper relates to three strands of literature. The first is the growing literature that provides empirical analysis on the impact of sanctions. So our contribution there is we try to look at subnational variation to provide some identification technique where we can provide an estimate of the impact of sanctions on North Korean economy. And then we bring in a spatial equilibrium model to try to quantify the aggregate impact on a country as a whole. We believe that differs from some of the previous approaches where it's mostly focused on looking at the country as a whole before and after the sanctions. We also use the spatial equilibrium model, which is based on the general framework developed in previous papers, and also adopt a more recent shift share design. What separates our paper is in our setting, we don't really have the high quality data that the other papers have. So our main challenge here was to try to adopt this model into a setting where the quality of economic data is somewhat lower, but we still want to use it as a way to provide some meaningful estimates and try to predict and try to conduct some counterfactual exercises. Finally, we also joined this larger literature that uses nighttime satellite images to try to understand and predict some important economic measures. So we're going to follow that and use subnational nightlight data to study the impact of an external shock on the local economy. Okay, so for the rest of the talk, I'll provide a brief background about the trade sanctions and then talk about data and focus on providing the reduced form estimates. For the structural model, I just provide a brief overview and some of the implications and estimates that come out from that structural model. Here's a timeline of the UN sanctions. I guess there are two key points that we can take away from this graph, from this figure. The first is the UN sanctions is actually a direct response to North Korea's missile or nuclear tests. So each sanction follows from mostly from North Korea conducting a nuclear test. So it's definitely an endogenous response to what North Korea has been doing. Second, if you divide the period into the first before 2016 and after 2016, you can see that most of the UN sanctions were targeting specific sectors or specific individuals. So it's mostly about a ban of military or arms related materials or sectors, or a ban on luxury goods, and coupled with targeting some of the prominent institutions and individuals. Whereas after 2016, the sanctions are now more broadly applied. In particular, it's a ban on North Korea's trade with the rest of the world. So our paper is going to be focusing on mostly the sanctions that were imposed in 2016 and 17, banning most of North Korea's trade. So here is some more context about specifically what was banned in the UN trade sanctions. So on the left, we see products that were banned under the UN trade sanctions. So the sectors that were banned were specifically targeting the major sectors that North Korea was exporting. So it told us about 88% of North Korea's pre-sanction exports, including coal, apparel, metal ores. You can also see that North Korea's major trading partner was China, but also followed by India and Netherlands. Regarding imports, it's definitely a smaller share. The UN didn't sanction some of the important sectors that North Korea was relying on, but it still totals about 38% of pre-sanctioned value of North Korean imports. But the sectors that were sanctioned was more essential for North Korea's industrial production. So later we'll see that if we look at the industry level sanctions, the sectors that were sanctioned were mostly important for North Korea's capacity for industrial production. This is just a descriptive view of looking at the UN Comtrade data, what we can see at least descriptively about what was happening about North Korea's trade patterns. So on the top left panel, it's North Korea's exports to the rest of the world. We can see that after the sanctions are starting to be imposed in 2016, the export of sanctioned products starts to drop and it reaches almost zero. Whereas products that were not sanctioned, although we do see a somewhat declining trend, it doesn't fall as much as what we see with the sanctioned products. Looking at the top right panel, we see imports that were sanctioned also drops to about zero. But for the products that were not sanctioned, we don't see that decline. Of course, these data are reported by, North Korea doesn't report any trade data. So this is solely coming from the trading partners. And of course, you might be suspicious whether these countries are reporting truthfully. For example, after the sanctions, maybe China starts reporting that they're exporting or importing from North Korea. So for that reason, we're not going to use any trade data after 2015. So our trade data is, our analysis is going to be based on trade data from 2011 to 2015, and then we're going to average that so that we're going to, the results are not sensitive to any short-run fluctuations during that period. Okay, so next, let me move on to the data. So unfortunately, we don't have any good economic measures inside North Korea. So we're going to use nightlight as a proxy for local economic activities. The literature reports that this has been somewhat widely used in economic studies. In fact, we're going to utilize the VRS nightlight dataset. Several studies show that this dataset overcomes the limitations with the previous nightlight data. For example, it doesn't suffer as much as regarding top coding. There aren't that much top coding issues. Also, if you look at the grid level data in North Korea, the previous satellite data, I think more than half of the grids are shown to have just zero value, which we suspect that it's not the case that there's actually no nightlight coming, but it's just very low intensity nightlight that the DMSP satellite is not picking up. Compared to that, if we look at the VRS, almost 95% of the grids do show a positive number, suggesting that the VRS is better at capturing very low intensities of nightlight. So we think that it's more suitable for studying countries such as North Korea. So the data is provided in monthly units. So we're going to average that at the quarter level and also combine the grids up to the county level. So the key question is, what activities is this nightlight data capturing? It's known for the satellite to take pictures at around 1:30 a.m. So we think in the North Korean context, this is not capturing nightlight coming out from the service industry. And we think it's more related to the manufacturing industry. And that's based on some of the anecdotal evidence coming out from news reports from North Korea. We also conducted interviews with North Korean defectors, and they were suggesting that night shifts are quite common in North Korean factories. And the street lights are known to turn off at around 12 a.m. So we believe that the nightlight data we're capturing can be a reasonable proxy for nightlight being coming out from these manufacturing firms, and therefore we're going to mostly interpret nightlight intensity as a measure for manufacturing activity. So one of the key data sets we use is going to be this North Korean firm database. So it's compiled by this agency called the Korean Institute for Industrial Economics and Trade. They traced articles from two major state-run North Korean newspaper companies starting in 2000. So they have by now they have more than 20 years of data. We're going to just use data from 2000 to 2015. And it contains information about each firm's location, so we can identify which county the firm is in, and also the industry classification which we can then map into the ISIC industry level. And they also report the number of times a firm has been mentioned in the news reports at the annual level. We aggregate that to the entire period. So there are two concerns regarding this data set. The first is it doesn't provide it doesn't provide information about the size of each firm. So that's going to be one of the challenges. A second challenge is that you might be worried that it doesn't report all the firms in North Korea. So there might be some type of selection bias there. So for the first concern about not knowing the size of the firm, we're going to proxy the size with the number of times the firm is mentioned. So in the South Korean context, it's like using the number of times Samsung has been mentioned in the newspaper in the past 15 years, using that as a proxy for the size of Samsung. And then for other firms, also using the number of times it's been being mentioned as a proxy for that size of the firm. In North Korea, there are no private firms, so they're all state-run. So we believe that these state-run newspapers might be a good proxy for capturing information about these companies. The second concern is whether we're leaving out some important companies. So we do this data validation exercise, and we look at the weight mentioned number of firms, how that correlates with the nightlight intensity and also the population before the sanctions. And we find a strong positive correlation indicating that at least the number of firms the number of times they're being mentioned does seem to provide, is a good predictor of the size of the economy at the county level. So we'll go ahead with using this data set. So using the UN Comtrade data, we construct these industry level sanction indices. So the export sanction index is just going to be the share of products that North Korea exported before the sanctions that has been export sanctioned by the UN. And we constructed that at the industry level. We have about 21 industries in our analysis. The intermediate input sanction index is constructed by first constructing an import sanction index. So that's going to be the share of products that are import sanctioned by the UN for a given industry K. And then we borrow China's input-output table from 2002 and then match that so that we can have a measure of the share of intermediate inputs of industry J that are sanctioned by the UN. We also conduct robustness checks using China's input-output table from 1987 and 1997. And they seem to provide similar estimates from our baseline. Okay, so these are just industry level sanction indices. So the food, textiles, apparel are you can see that for those that are sanctioned, it's almost close to a full sanction. So a full sanction would be if the measure is equal to 1, and 0 means that there are no sanctioned products at all in that industry. So it seems to suggest that if an industry is sanctioned, then it's close to a full sanction. If you look at the intermediate inputs, we also can see that some of the key industries for industrial production were also heavily sanctioned by the UN during this period. So using the industry level sanction index, we can construct a regional sanction exposure measure. So ideally, we would want to have some data on the industry output share at the county level. We don't have that, so we're going to use the share of mentions of firms in a given industry in each county as a proxy. So the county level export sanction exposure is going to be the weighted average of the industries in that using where we weight the industry by using the share of the mention of the firms of that industry in that county. Okay, so the variation across counties here is coming from this term in the middle, which is basically the share of this function of number of firms in that industry in county N. Okay, we use a similar approach to construct the county level intermediate input sanction exposure. So for identification, our main variation across counties is going to come from this term that we construct using the number of mentions. So the larger the mentions of the industry in that county, it's going to put a larger weight on the industry level sanction exposure for that county. So our identification assumption is going to be that this constructed region industry share has to be uncorrelated with other determinants of change in the local nightlight intensity. We follow the literature and conduct some diagnosis tests and also robustness checks to try to validate this identification assumption. Also for the main specification, we're going to use this log. We're going to transform into log, but we also transform and use other functional forms, and the results are shown to be robust. So this is
Steph has a question.
Yeah, I just have a very quick clarifying question. So the location of the firms, this is firm level data, not plant level data, right?
This is firm level data. That's correct. Yeah.
And then so you're locating the firm by the headquarters of the firm as listed in the data set of firms.
So to give you a sense of how we constructed. Well, I mean, I guess I should take back that I said it's a firm level data, because the way it's introduced in the article is if there's a factory that's been constructed in County A, for example, it's going to, in the newspaper, it's going to introduce as, this new plant, or this plant in County A is now going to go through this investment procedure, or they're going to increase their capacity. So in some sense, I guess, to be honest, it's probably a mix of collecting the firm level data and also plant level data, depending on how the newspaper is going to elaborate or introduce that company in the newspaper.
This may be better for you, actually, because if it really is plant level data, then you would have higher confidence that the nightlight data would be picking up real economic activity, right?
That's true. That's true. So the way it's introduced is, again, if a factory in County A increase their capacity, it's going to be introduced in that sense in the newspaper. Hopefully it's something that we're capturing. The firm data set is capturing actual economic activities happening at that location rather than some other location. Okay, thanks. All right, so this is just some spatial distribution. So just two things to take away. First, what's interesting is both the export sanction exposure and the intermediate input sanction exposure are somewhat dispersed across the country. So it's not like it's all located in one area or one region in the country, but it's more or less widely scattered across. Second is the correlation between the export sanction and the intermediate input sanction is actually quite low. It's about, in numbers, it's -0.1. We also don't see a high level of correlation just based on this map. So that's going to help us separately try to identify the impact of these different sanctions on North Korea's economy. So I'll skip the summary statistics in the interest of time, but the average export sanction was about 0.55, and then the average intermediate input sanction was about 0.17. These are at the county level. So market price data we purchase from a company. So it collects biweekly data from the markets. We're going to aggregate that at the quarter level. So we have information about the price, the origin, also the specific brand names. Our data is going to cover 20 export sanctioned products, 8 import sanctioned, and 42 non-sanctioned products. And we're going to try to see how before and after the sanctions, how the price of these products are going to change to provide some additional insight into what's happening in North Korea at North Korea's markets with the UN trade sanctions. Okay, so we're going to adopt 2 empirical strategies here. The first, we're going to try to just look at the long run difference during the 5 years. So in the first specification on the left-hand side, we have the change in log night intensity at the county level from 2014 to 2019. On the right-hand side, we have the county level export sanction exposure and also the county level input sanction exposure. So alpha 1 and alpha 2 here are trying to estimate what's the impact of export sanctions on the change in nightlight intensity in a county. In the second specification, this is a quarterly different specification where we're trying to capture more short-run dynamics about the nightlight and the sanction exposures. Here, we're going to interact the county-level export sanction exposure with the post-sanction indicator. For the main analysis, we're going to use the indicator is going to be equal to 1 if the quarter is past the first quarter of 2017. But we also look at the heterogeneous impact of different sanction waves in a separate analysis. And where we also control for the county fixed effects and also the quarter fixed effects. Okay, so this is just some graphical evidence. Overall, we find a negative relationship between the sanction exposures and also the change in nightlight. So this is again like the long run difference, suggesting that increase in the sanction exposures are going to lead to lower levels of a change in nightlight intensity. This is our main table for the region-form analysis. So we find that in panel A, the long run estimate suggests that a 10% increase in export sanction exposure leads to a drop in nightlight intensity by about 3.54 log points here. 10% increase in input sanction exposure leads to about drop in nightlight by about 5.3 log points. In the last column, we include both sanction exposure measures. Because these don't have high correlations, we find that the estimates are quite similar. So again, like to convert these into meaningful economic measures, we separately estimate the GDP nightlight elasticity. The elasticity that we find is about 0.419. So comparing that using that to convert these region-form estimates, we find that the long-run difference estimates imply that 10% sanction in exports reduces manufacturing GDP by about 1.4%, and also the 10% increase in intermediate sanction exposure reduces manufacturing GDP by about 2%. And so these are the long-run differences. In panel B, we also report the short-run responses, where we find that the estimates are about 50% larger. We believe that the reason for that is because in the short run, in the long run, the government probably has more resources to reallocate or respond to these sanction measures. So therefore, overall, in the long run, the impact of sanctions seems to be somewhat smaller. So for that reason, in the spatial equilibrium model, we're going to take these long run estimates in trying to calibrate and estimating the parameters where we're trying to come up with the aggregate outcome. So Jungmin, I don't think I have much time, so let me quickly move on. So I'll skip this. So we conduct a battery of robustness checks and also do a bar decomposition analysis following the recent trend. And overall, the estimates are similar to what we find in the main analysis. So these are just results from the market price data. Just quickly, graphically, the takeaway here is for the import sanction products, we find a surge in the price of these products after the last wave of sanction in the last quarter of 2017. But we don't find that same price change for the products that weren't sanctioned, suggesting that the import sanction is having some constraint on North Korea's supply of these products. And we don't find much of a change in export sanction products, although it does seem to decrease in the first quarter of 2019. Looking at the heterogeneity, this is what I said in the preview. So the price increase is only observed among markets that are outside Pyongyang, but we don't find that increase for markets in Pyongyang. Probably some differences going on between markets that are in Pyongyang and outside Pyongyang. This is a table using the market prices, but the results are qualitative, similar to what I showed in the graphs. Okay, so just an overview of spatial equilibrium model. So the purpose here is we want to have an interpretation of the reduced form coefficients where we can try to infer the general equilibrium impact of the sanctions on the North Korean economy, and also use that to predict some alternative scenarios. For example, what's going to happen if North Korea has to close their trade deficits. We borrow the model from Adao's 2020 paper and make several assumptions about the economy. Notably, while we don't allow for migration across regions, we're going to allow labor to be mobile imperfectly across the sectors within a region for the analysis. An interesting parameter that comes out from this model where we estimate is that, so this is our prediction. So if we believe in the model, we find that North Korea's manufacturing export to GDP ratio is about 0.36. This is somewhat higher than what the Bank of Korea estimates, but still one of the lowest in the world. Using this estimate, we're able to then back out what's the overall aggregate impact of trade sanctions on North Korea's manufacturing output. And we find that number to be about, so we find that the sanctions reduces manufacturing output by about 20%. Considering that North Korea's manufacturing GDP sector is about estimated to be about 20% of the overall economy, we believe that this number is quite sizable and important enough to have a meaningful impact on North Korea's economy. This is much higher than what we find by doing a back of the envelope calculation based on the reduced form estimates. A possible explanation is that the reduced form estimates isn't capturing any general equilibrium effects and also doesn't take into account of the spillover effects. So that might be one possible explanation why we find larger numbers here. Our estimates are slightly higher than what the BOK estimates using the cumulative decline in manufacturing GDP during that same period. We can compare our estimates to some of the other studies that come out. So for example, a study shows that a blockade on Gaza Strip reduced real consumption by about 14 to 27%. Another study shows that the welfare loss from being an autarky in Eastern European countries led to about a 27 to 38% drop in welfare. So we believe that our numbers are somewhat comparable to what other studies find. So one counterfactual scenario that we do is what would happen to North Korea's manufacturing output if they had to close its trade deficit? The reason why we were interested in this question is even before the sanctions, North Korea was running a large deficit. And then after the sanctions, that number grew to about 2 billion from 0.61 billion. So that totals about 58% of pre-sanction total exports. And the UN sanctions also mandated that the countries, they actually recommended that the countries have to repatriate the overall overseas workers by 2019. So then the question is, what if North Korea has to balance its trade deficit? What would happen to their manufacturing output? So we run a couple of counterfactual scenarios. So if North Korea has to, the first row is what we find without closing the trade deficit. If they have to close the trade deficit to the pre-sanction level, that we find that the real output drops by about additional 8 percentage points. If North Korea has to completely close their trade deficit, so if they have to make the trade deficit equal to 0, then there's another additional 6 percentage point decline. So the overall drop in real output would be about 14 percentage points if North Korea has to close their trade deficit. Then the last row is a counterfactual where we assume that if North Korea faces a full sanction of all their sectors, then their real output would drop by about more than half. So we believe that some of these counterfactual scenarios might be interesting to look at from the point of view of policy design. We also do a counterfactual doing a sanction scenario by sector, where we find that some of the most important export sectors would have a larger impact on North Korea's economy. So let me conclude. So our paper finds evidence that North Korea's regions that were more exposed to export or intermediate input sanctions do experience a larger drop in nightlight intensity. To back out the aggregate impact, we combine the reduced form estimates with the quantitative model, and we find that overall the economy showed there was about a 20% reduction in manufacturing output as a result of the UN trade sanctions. We also do a counterfactual exercise to see how the North Korea's manufacturing output would vary if North Korea would have to balance their trade. So that's all I have for today. I'll be happy to receive any questions.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so I have many questions, and I believe panelists and people have many questions. So I want to remind you that all participants can leave your questions by using Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So please leave your comments and questions there. So before that, okay, so Munsop has comments. Munsop, you can go.
Yeah. Hi, Sangyoon. Yeah, thank you for the fantastic presentation. It's super interesting. I found that you found that the output loss, the estimated from the model is larger than the output loss estimated from the reduced form the exercise. So, and then you say that that's the combination of general equilibrium and then spillover. So I have two questions. The first one is, I mean, is it a valid assumption that the prices are actually the clearing the market in the North Korea? Because you mentioned that the pricing behavior in Pyongyang and other cities are quite different. So that's the first question. And then the second question is, oh, actually I forgot. Yeah, I will go with this one question about whether it is valid assumption the price is clearing.
Yeah, so no, that's a great question. So I guess recently if we look at some of the news reports from North Korea, they do operate these informal markets outside the formal market, where the formal market might be more exposed to price control mechanisms. They have these markets called Jangmadang and also some of the other, I think, Metugi. They have some other type of markets where it's more closer to private trade. So I would say yes. We think that even though there are these price control mechanisms in place, for example, in Pyongyang, we think that overall they do have these black markets and private markets in place where overall the price clearing is possible, but that's something we can't, I guess, completely verify or can't provide any more detailed evidence happening. But regarding the model assumptions, I think we tried our best relying on anecdotal evidence to try to validate some of the important model assumptions that we're making. For example, whether labor is mobile at all across the regions, whether labor is mobile across the sectors. So some of the assumptions we make might not be perfectly matching with what is happening in North Korea in reality, but yeah, I think if we did find any anecdotal evidence that didn't seem to match the model assumptions, we did try to change them so that it can reflect somewhat closely what's actually going on in North Korea. But yeah, thank you for that question.
Yeah, thank you.
Is there any possibility that the production is switched from nighttime to daytime? Because production during nighttime requires electricity more. So if we are short of the materials and the oil, crude oil, then it would be they would switch their production from nighttime to daytime.
Yeah, that's a great.
In that case, you may overestimate the cost. Yeah.
Right. So for that to bias, I guess that shift should also be somewhat across counties and and should correlate with these sanction exposure measures, right? So in the event of that, then we would see. So then I guess your question might be closer to whether, so our sanction exposure measure heavily relies on this cross-county variation in how this constructed region industry share. So if that's somewhat correlated with their decision to shift the production activity from nightlight to daytime, then that's a potential source of bias. We did think carefully about what this that possibility. I guess like one thing that might go against that is it's well known that North Korea has been subject to shortage of electricity and also resources important for production. So I think if you think about, so from an engineering point of view, or from an economic efficiency point of view, it's actually more efficient to produce in the nighttime, to use the oil and to use electricity in nighttime, because then in the daytime, they can at least direct some of these energy to power up government buildings and also for household production. And then in the remaining, they can then direct to factories, especially for production in nighttime. So yeah, also talking with some of the North Korean defectors, it seems they also seem to suggest quite a lot of it's quite prevalent to see factories operating during the nighttime. Although I don't know if that's because there was a shortage in electricity during the daytime, or it was just because they were trying to just because they have to satisfy the supply of these demand, they were just operating these 24-hour shifts. But yeah, it's so I think overall, if anything, they would be more likely to continue their production in the nighttime in order to have efficiency with the use of electricity. Another source of evidence that's coming out from these anecdotal reports is actually the price of energy the price of coal fell a lot because of these export sanctions. So they were arguing that energy was actually cheaper for generating energy was cheaper after the sanctions. So we think that that shift is unlikely to have been driven by shortage of energy compared to before. It's not driven after the sanctions. Yeah.
Good. Okay. Step, do you have any comments? Questions?
I'm still thinking, so give me a couple.
Oh, yeah, okay. So
if there's a question,
it's a very rich paper. I should just emphasize to the audience, I mean, nothing like even close to this has ever been done. I mean, it's really an extraordinary paper. And I guess the one interim comment I would make is whether, just for publication purposes, you want to reduce the complexity of the paper. I'll just be honest with you. Look, I'm not an economist, but I just think the reduced form findings are in some ways much more convincing and directly intuitive than the very substantial set of assumptions that are going into the spatial equilibrium model because of the need to rely on a Chinese input-output matrix, because of all of the things you have to assume about prices and mobility of factors and so forth. I mean, I'd really like to hear, Munsub and Jungmin comment on that because I think a case could be made that, I know this is terrible to say because you put so much work into it, but I think a case could be made that section is just sort of less believable, if you know what I mean. It strikes me as it's almost more like a simulation exercise than it is a model of the North Korean economy that you could trust, because you're really saying something like, if the North Korean economy looked like this, and we change these, export and import, impose these export and import restraints, then this is what it would look like. Am I making sense, or am I just babbling?
No, yeah. I think you have a good point there. I guess maybe to put it honestly, when we first started, bringing in this spatial equilibrium model, I guess it's possible that we didn't have a really clear idea of what are the challenges we're facing. Like, because we see a lot of these papers using spatial equilibrium models in other countries. It's somewhat conventional if you want to estimate some general equilibrium effect. So we were following that. And then once we started to try to match, try to go over the assumptions more carefully and try to match it to North Korea, then we quickly found out that, okay, this assumption we have to validate, it's not clear, this assumption as well, and so on and so on. So yeah, the more we were paying attention to this, spatial equilibrium model, the more we were, really questioning these assumptions. But I guess we agree that there's this important clause, or there's this strong assumption that if we do believe in this model, then this is what we would find out. And we thought that, this is definitely risky, especially as you said, for publication purposes and also for, interacting with the audience and so on. But we thought that this might be a risk that's worth taking, given that we know so little about North Korea, right? There's so little data. And if the model can help just a bit of understanding, providing a measure which maybe not precise, but can just help us provide a bigger picture where from there on, other papers can also think about other interesting, innovative ways of how to deal with the scarcity of data and try to provide some meaningful policy implication. We thought that in that sense, there is some meaning to doing this exercise. So yes, I think I'm more of a reduced form person. So when I see these models, I question these assumptions. But my experience with this paper is, given that we really don't know much about North Korea, why don't we just bring in something and just try to provide and just squeeze a bit more? What thing can we really try to squeeze out from this data and from this paper that can help us just a little bit more to understand North Korea? And if this exercise serves that purpose, then I think we would be perfectly happy, right? Rather than really providing a innovation from the methodology side, it's more about just trying to provide some understanding about North Korea. But yeah, that's a very fair point and very useful.
You can always move it to the appendix, so don't worry about it.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, depending on how much people like it or not. Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah.
I think this would be very fascinating. So you mentioned this paper. The purpose of this paper is not about the political problem. The North Korea missiles and nuclear tests, but somehow I'm sure there are many implications for politics of this paper. So I have heard the result of the economic sanctions, the Singapore summit was the result of the economic sanctions for a long time. So at the time, North Korea had no choice but meeting South Korea and the U.S. Do you have anything to say about politics? And it'd be very nice if you have some model or do empirical analysis to look at the political outcomes.
Right. Thanks, Jungmin. So while giving this talk, several people suggested, why don't we go one step further to provide some analysis from the policy perspective, which can help understand, I guess, the bigger picture, the bigger question that we don't look at here, or it's not that we don't, but we actually can't look at is has the trade sanctions been achieving its goal, its primary goal, which is deterring North Korea's nuclear activity and also military activity. So I'll be honest and say we don't have a really good answer for that, but let me share my personal opinion based on what we think we find here. So the reason why UN imposed this trade sanction was to first provide economic pressure and to the regime so that then the regime would change course of how it wants to conduct its nuclear or missile activities. So in some sense, you can think of this like as one of the first goals was to provide economic pressure. This paper or this study is suggesting that, that at least that goal was partially accomplished in the sense that we do find some evidence suggesting that North Korea's economy was impacted by the trade sanctions. But of course, whether that led to a change in North Korea's policy is something that's still in a black box that we can't really look at. I showed you this descriptive figure at the very early stage. We're showing that, at least after the sanctions, we didn't see nuclear activities. Overall, the missile tests are still going on, but it seems a little bit less intense than what we saw before. But these are descriptive. We can't really say there's a causal relationship. But at least one thing I learned from this analysis is, especially regarding the trade sanctions, it seems that their number one trade partner is China. So anecdotally, China also seemed to comply with these sanction resolutions, at least starting in 2018. Okay, and we believe that that has been a very important factor in the trade sanctions. And going forward, designing these sanction policies, I guess what's really important is, like, are there any loopholes or how the country can actually, what's the country's tolerance level to these sanctions is going to be key factors in determining how effective these sanctions are going to be in in achieving their policy goals.
Mm-hmm. Steph?
Yeah, so the data on the strength of sanctions enforcement is captured almost entirely by the trade relationship between North Korea and China. And so you're basically working with Chinese customs data, right? Because the rest of the world is a relatively minimal player. But then there's the question of sanctions evasion and smuggling. But I think that what's interesting about your paper is that even with some degree of smuggling, which would reduce the level of sanctions enforcement, let's just say by some increment across each sector, you still have these very substantial effects. Mm-hmm. So again, this gets back to the reduced form versus the spatial equilibrium thing. And the more I think about it, the more inclined I am to suggest to you that you really cut that section so you can play around with some of these other parameters, that are sort of more directly believable. Like what would happen if you just, ran some counterfactuals where, North Korea was able to smuggle around 20% of the sanctions or 30% of the sanctions. Things like that would be really valuable and I think more directly intuitive than the general equilibrium model. I really want to hear Munso and Sung-min on this though, because
I see the many value added from the model because there are several deep parameters the Sangyoon is estimating. By doing this exercise, as you can see from this slide, the export to GDP ratio, which is unknown. So, here's the backing out. So and then I think the Sangyoon, you are also ready to calculate the welfare, which is never observable. So if you want to do, you can also calculate the welfare. This is gonna be, again, the maybe less credible, but the welfare, there is no way to observe that from the data. But in the model, I think you may not want to push too much. You reported the real output loss, but your model is already ready to calculate the real welfare loss for the customers. So what is the welfare loss among the North Korea's the individual people, the customer? That question itself is really the big important question. But again, it's your choice whether you want to push that far or not. I see many value added. That's my summary.
Yeah. At some point, we did have this discussion of how much are you going to push, and definitely, as Moonsub said, welfare is something the model will give us like a number, but we didn't go that far precise. Maybe because inside ourselves, maybe we weren't that comfortable making a welfare statement, whereas for the real output, we were it at least fits what we were trying to do with the reduced form estimate, in the sense of we're still along that line of trying to find what's the change in manufacturing output. But yeah, as Moonsub said, definitely welfare is something we can easily add to this analysis. Yeah.
Right, but again, I'm repeating myself, but note how the price data, if you look at the price data on the import restricted items, and you take those increases in prices as a kind of proxy for a welfare loss, in some ways it's just, again, more intuitive and simple and direct. I mean, North Koreans are paying 35% more for everything, for imports that are sanctioned. I mean, that's just super straightforward.
Right. So we actually, after writing this sub, we collected more price data from this consulting company. So it covers more markets and more products. So we're planning to do, probably not in the framework of trade sanctions, but another project trying to use that market price data. So yeah, I believe that there is something we can do using that price data, potentially maybe inferring the welfare of customers. But yeah, I think I said at the beginning that you can see that some of there are several parts where which for now we put it all together, but there is room for separating out. I agree.
I know we are over time, but can I ask one quick question? So I mean, do anyone have a wage data? Because in order to calculate the welfare, you need the price and wage. I mean, do anyone ever collected the wage data, even anecdotally, from the North Korea?
Survey. I think survey, refugee survey, wage, earnings. Yeah, earnings. Yes.
Yeah, owning is already good enough. So yeah, I wonder, I mean, if that data is available, the reduced form calculation of the welfare, as Stefan said, yes. So combining the price and wage, that's already the good measure for welfare.
In the North Korea, in the company data that we have, we do have like some wage data. It's not for like I don't think we have for manufacturers, but we have for several occupations there, which we can also use. Yeah.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
We're running out of time. This is fascinating paper. I think 1 hour is too short for this paper, apparently. Okay, thank you, Sangyoon, for giving us excellent talk. And thank you, panelists and all participants. Okay, this is it. Thank you very much.
Fantastic paper. Everyone should read it, yeah.
Thank you so much for the comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So long, everyone.
So long.